All right, good evening and welcome to this public meeting of the Standing Committee on Government Operations. My name is Julian Morse. I'm the MLA for Frame Lake and chair of this standing committee. Today, the Northwest Territories Official Languages Commissioner and the Northwest Territories Equal Pay Commissioners will report their 2023-24 annual reports to committee. Please note that this meeting is being live streamed to the Assembly's and social media channels. So I'll just ask members in the room and online to I think we've just got in the room. So I will now ask members in the room to introduce themselves for the record. I'll start with Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and welcome. My name is Denny Rogers. I'm the MLA for Inuvik Boot Lake.
Good evening. I'm MLA Kate Reed, MLA for Great Slave.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Robert Hawkins, MLA for Yawning Center, and as always, happy to be here.
Okay, thank you. So I would just like to remind all members and our witness to direct all questions and comments to myself as the chair and wait to be recognized before speaking because it'll help us have a smoother meeting with the audio visual. So I'm now going to pass it on to Languages Commissioner Ms. Brenda M. Gauthier to introduce herself and proceed with her presentation. Go ahead, Ms. Gauthier.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Brenda Gauthier, and my office is situated in Fort Smith, the Office of the Language Commissioner, and I will proceed with my presentation at this time. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you loud and clear. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, Mr. Chair. I would like to thank the Standing Committee on Government Operations for your time today to review the Office of the Language Commissioner's annual report for the 2023-2024 year. The Languages Commissioner's position is established with the Official Languages Act. The mandate of the Languages Commissioner is to investigate complaints that violate the legislation and also promote the office of the Languages Commissioner. This position has a narrow scope in comparison to the minister responsible for official languages and the Languages Board, which are also established with the same legislation. I was appointed to the Language Commissioner role in January 2021 for a 4-year term. I'm currently in the last 6 months of my term and am preparing to leave the office. The Northwest Territories has 11 official languages, and they are English, French, Chipewyan, South Slavey, North Slavey, Gwich'in, Inuktitut, Inuktitut, Inuvialuktun, Cree, and Huichol. The annual report that we will be discussing today covers a 1-year period from April 1st, 2023 to March 31st, 2024. The stats from the Bureau of Statistics is unchanged from their 2022 report, where it indicates that there is a continued decline in Indigenous language speakers for the NWT. Inuktitut is the only Indigenous language that saw an increase in speakers. English and French remain strong in the Northwest Territories. There were 5 complaints in this reporting period. The first complaint regarding the office of the Language Commissioner's website, stating it did not recognize the Willa-Day Dene language. As the Willa-Day language is not an official language by legislation, this file was closed. There were 2 complaints regarding the signs of 2 different buildings in Yellowknife. One complaint was regarding the primary care location in the YK Center East building. This building was reviewed and did not violate the legislation, and the file was closed. Since that time, additional information was received regarding this complaint, and the file is currently reopened and being investigated. The second signage complaint was regarding the Northwest Hell building. At the time, additional information was also requested without a response, so the file was closed. Since the filing of this report, we have received the additional information requested and are currently working on this file. A complaint was also received regarding the wildfire evacuations and the lack of interpretation. More information was requested and not received, so the file was closed. The additional information was required as we need to know what notifications that were of concern, as our office is limited to investigating the government of the Northwest Territories services. If the notifications came from a radio station or community government, they are out of our scope. The final complaint received was regarding the Health and Social Services website. With the information we provided, we reviewed the website and could not locate the issue. Additional information was requested without a response, so the file was closed. As indicated, the office will reopen closed files when additional information regarding the complaint is received. It has recently also come to the attention of the Language Commissioner that some government departments have an internal complaints process, and language complaints are being submitted through that mechanism as well. When that mechanism is used, my office is not informed of these complaints that go through that route. I am not sure how many of these impacts are going to that office. However, it's come to my attention that one organization that I usually would get a complaint from has been using that route with the understanding that I would be informed of these complaints. So, which is not the case. I'm not aware that they were using that route, and I was not aware that there was other routes being used to file complaints regarding languages that have nothing to do with my office. Two recommendations that were put forward in the annual report that I know that has been reviewed are, this recommendation is a repeat from last year, as it is believed to be an important requirement that the government of the Northwest Territories create a separate division that focuses specifically on official Indigenous languages of the Northwest Territories, and a secretariat that mirrors the Francophone Affairs Secretariat, or a division that's similar. Taken off of the Francophone Affairs Secretariat website, the services that they provide are that they provide advice and support to government institutions. They develop orientations for programs for French language service coordinators, coordinate French translation services for the government of the Northwest Territories, liaison with the Francophone community, and ensure systematic audits of the French language communication and services they provide. The second recommendation I put forward is that the government of the Northwest Territories do more to provide services in all official languages in the government institutions in all communities. And one way to accomplish this is to work more collaboratively with the Indigenous regional governments in this regard. The Office of the Language Commissioner continues to collaborate and connect with the territorial, federal, and international level counterparts to discuss best practices and global issues and ways to support our offices. The International Languages Commissioners Association and the Forum of Canadian Ombudsmen are two of these organizations with large membership. There are 7 language commissioners in Canada, and we're working on formalizing our working relationships. In conclusion, I just want to state that the last 3+ years have been very educational for me in my role of Languages Commissioner. I see that the people of the Northwest Territories are very passionate about their language and culture. I have seen and continue to see improvements in language provision in government services. However, there's still a lot of work that is still needed. Language revitalization is getting a lot of attention. However, services in official languages is required to support the revitalization work. The languages need to be heard in all government settings. Thank you. That concludes my presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Gauthier, for the presentation. I'm going to turn it over to committee members for questions now. I have Mr. Hawkins first, and Ms. Reid, you'll be up next.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ms. Gauthier. I appreciate your time as a commissioner, and I have actually some questions with respect to sort of the overall view of your terms, not so specific to the report. The report does repeat previous engagement recommendations, which are certainly noted and no less important in any form, but I was more thinking along the lines in looking at the report, it kind of made me wonder, are we doing the best job we can? In other words, is there a better way to do this? Now, I want to qualify my questions simply by saying there's no critiquing or criticism of official languages in the statement, or is there a belief that any way that we should care less about them? But from your experience, do you think there's a better way or better role that the commissioner's role could be overseen, knowing that you're in the last 6 months of your term, in context of so few complaints are coming forward? And that's got me wondering, how do we get more engagement? Thank you.
Thank you. Over to the Commissioner for response.
Thank you. Excuse me. I have been giving this a lot of thought. I will admit it is challenging working in an environment where we know there's a lot of issues and concerns regarding language throughout the government services. It is challenging in the fact that I do know there's valid concerns out there. I have a lot of informal discussions. I try to meet and hear those concerns and try to figure out ways to support everyone. And I will admit it's challenging. It's challenging knowing that there's such little flow through this office. It's been my understanding, it's been a common issue with all language commissioners that there has been a low status of complaints coming in. My biggest thing is that I tried to ensure that people knew who I was, and that I was committed to working on language issues while I was in this role. The way to improve things, and I will admit I often look to Nunavut and how the language commissioner in Nunavut is moving forward. They have a broader scope to the role of the language commissioner in Nunavut. And I am aware that that position was created to mirror this position. We've gone in different directions on the role of the languages commissioner. My role is very limited. If you look at the legislation, I am to investigate and I am to promote my office. I cannot pick up the phone according to legislation and discuss concerns with different departments. I have requested this when I've met with different departments when they were considering changes to the legislation. So I really do feel that my hands are tied in a lot of cases on what I can do in this role. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Mr. Hawkins for follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No, I appreciate your perspective. My next question is really about looking forward in the sense of in the future. And languages can, let me say it this way, I really believe that languages are keystone to cultures, and they are a way of looking at cornerstones of how they build their community, how they communicate, how they feel about who they are in the context of history and meaning. And every language tells a story in its own way, as do every people. Now, we all maybe say one peoples, but you know, there's so many elements to everyone, and languages are sort of the way that inherently gets, that story gets told. So knowing the challenges we have with so many languages here in the Northwest Territories, and I agree with you that you know, there's certainly no shortage of challenges. What would you be making recommendations in light of your report, the way it's contextualized, the way your recommendations are coming forward? What recommendations would you make to the incoming languages commissioner if they were sitting here today to say, hey, you know, I'm not telling you what to do, but don't miss the opportunity of taking note of this, or seeing this as, you know, this is a future problem, or maybe this might be the gateway to potential success. Thank you.
Thank you. Over to the Commissioner for response.
Thank you. There's two approaches that I'm thinking of for the incoming language commissioner. I do really stress relationships. It's important to establish relationships. What I see or have seen in the past is there's a lot of turnover with all organizations, and to continue meeting with those organizations because of the turnover in staff. It's you continually have to educate incoming staff of your role and how you're there to support them. One other area that I would really encourage, and I don't know how much you can do because it's a government program, is right now the territorial government provides funding to Indigenous governments for their language programs. But language and culture fall under two different pots of funding, I believe. And if we, as Mr. Hawkins had indicated, language and cultures are tied together. You live and speak your language. This is what we are as Aboriginal people. However, the pots of funding that flows to the communities, you cannot tie them together. You cannot run language programs that are tied to culture. You cannot, and that's been a challenge that I've heard continually from the different Indigenous organizations, that the territorial government is very strict on how they could run their language programs. So they cannot tie it in any way to culture when they're trying to run language programs.
Okay, thank you. I have Ms. Reed next for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Gauthier, for your presentation. I heard you say a little bit earlier that you feel that in your role you may not have all of the tools available to you that you need. I noticed in your report there was 5 complaints this year. 2 were not credible, 3 were credible, but had to be closed, 1 being reopened, I believe it said. So I guess I'd like to know a little bit more about what tools and processes that your office has available to you to reach out to people who make complaints, what efforts are made before an investigation is deemed that it cannot proceed. Thank you.
Thanks. Over to the Commissioner for a response.
Thank you. We do try to, we're willing to take complaints in person, over the phone, by fax, or by email. Whatever way is the easiest to help the complainant. I will give you an example of what we're receiving, and I know, I did look at that, and I know it doesn't look good that when we're closing files before we proceed, but when we're getting complaints such as, sorry, I'm just looking for the wording, that a web page and government program, so this is the wording in the complaint, a web page and government program is not in compliance with the Official Languages Act. So that's what I get. And so so we've reviewed the web page, we can't find the issue. The complainant obviously believes there's an issue there, but we can't find it. And so we go back to them. We will try to phone, and then we'll also try to email. We'll do what we can. But if there's no response, I can't keep the file open, and that's why we will open the files again. So we do get quite a few that's just basically by non-compliance with the Official Languages Act, and that's the concern that we're starting to get, or we're getting. And so we are trying to. I will admit that a lot of the complainants that we do talk to are very concerned about confidentiality. So I do not know if that's the issue why they're concerned. I do know if we are going to investigate anything, they're very concerned about putting their names forward. They're very concerned about being found out that they put the language complaint forward. That is a big concern that I do hear on a regular basis, is the privacy and confidentiality.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Reed, do you have a follow-up?
No, thank you very much for that answer. I'm just thinking through while you were explaining the process, and thank you for that example. It's very helpful. But yeah, I'm just wondering if there's any tools or amendments to the legislation that you could see could help alleviate some of those problems that you're facing. Thank you.
Over to the Commissioner for response.
Thank you for the question. We have been looking at updating the website to see if there's a way that could alleviate some of the issues. We do try to meet and be in the community as much as possible, and we, as I indicated, we'll take the complaints then and there if they're willing to proceed with it. I will admit I'm really stumped. This is an issue that I do bring up to the international boards and the higher committees that I work with on how to address this issue. And it's not an issue that I alone are in, and I alone am encountering. It's an issue that's been occurring across the board. So it's not a new issue. It's just, I will admit, we've tried what we can. I'm not really sure how we can do it. Address the issue. We could try to be in the community more. Yeah, it's something that I have been looking into and having discussions on for a few years, and I don't think I've moved any further with the issue than I am currently in now.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any further questions from committee for the first round with the Languages Commissioner? Mr. Rogers, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just looking through, so it's my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, I certainly have been before, but your role is basically just looking into languages with government services and government institutions, correct? So if that's the case, would you say the majority, and when you look at your list of complaints, I guess, throughout the year, would you consider most complaints of a kind of a major complaint, or is there minor things that can be easily corrected? Thank you.
Thank you. Over to the Commissioner.
Thank you. A lot of them can be easily corrected, and I will admit the departments that I've been working with that have had complaints are very agreeable to working with us to correct any issue that's come up. And they have been. The issue that I think that is a higher level government-wide issue is the lack of, sorry, I'm trying to think of the correct word. As I mentioned for my recommendation, is that there's no centralized secretariat for the departments to go to get consistent services regarding Indigenous languages. The Francophone Secretariat does have a place that departments can go when they have issues regarding the French language, if they need translations, if they need assistance with wording and just different things. Whereas if you go to ECE's Indigenous Language and Education Secretariat, my understanding, you want translation, you print off a list of translators off the website. And whether or not there is quality work from those translators, there's nothing to say. You just basically have to do the work on yourself to get that services for each department. So that's one of the biggest issues that I see government-wide. The department may be looking at addressing this issue. However, I'm not aware of it right now.
Thank you, Mr. Rogers. Do you have a follow-up?
No, I think that kind of answers my second question as well, Mr. Chair, that what is kind of one of the biggest issues facing the Commission. But no follow-up, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That goes for the first round of questions. Do we have a second round of questions? Do any MLAs have further questions for the Commissioner? Okay. So not seeing any further questions, Ms. Gauthier, I just wanted to thank you for the report and for taking the time to present to committee. Certainly we'll take the recommendations into account and report back on them to the House. So, and since it is kind of, we won't be seeing you again, thank you for all your work for the people of the territory. We really appreciate it and wish you all the best in your future endeavors.
Thank you. I really appreciate having this opportunity. Thank you.
Okay. So just a second, I'm just going to check with committee staff on when we'll be back on with the next, sorry? I did. Okay. Okay, so committee, we will be back on at, and to anyone tuning in, we'll be back on at 6:30 p.m. with the Equal Pay Commissioner. So we'll take a brief break here and be back online for 6:30 for our next presentation. Okay. Okay, folks, welcome back to the Standing Committee on Government Operations meeting this August 29th. The committee will now receive a presentation from the Equal Pay Commissioner, Renée Caron. I would like to remind all members, but more importantly the Commissioner, to direct all questions and comments to myself as Chair and wait to be recognized. That just helps us with our audio visual. I will now pass it on to the Equal Pay Commissioner. Please introduce yourself and proceed with your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. So my name is Renée Caron, and I am the Northwest Territories Equal Pay Commissioner. I will share my screen so that you can see the presentation. Okay, so I hope everyone can see it. So I'd like to thank you all for allowing me to appear before you to discuss the Equal Pay Commissioner's annual report for 2023-2024. I would like to start by acknowledging that the Northwest Territories lost a longtime public servant in 2023, Mrs. Bronwyn Waters. Ms. Waters was the Equal Pay Commissioner from 2021 to 2023, and before that served many years in the government of the Northwest Territories. Although I never met her, I am grateful for the work that Ms. Waters did to advance the cause of pay equity. I've prepared my speaking points in 3 parts in line with the presentation. So first I'll cover a bit about what is equal pay for work of equal value, or I like to just call it pay equity for short. Then I will talk about what was done in 2023-24, and I will finish by talking about what's planned for 24-25. So starting with pay equity, basically it is the right of women to receive equal pay for work of equal value, regardless of their gender, within a workplace. And it's a basic equality issue. So fairness is really at the heart of ensuring people who do so-called women's work are paid equally to people who do so-called men's work in the same workplace. There are other reasons for pay equity, and an important one is the gender wage gap. So I have some data from Canada. Unfortunately, I don't have data for the Northwest Territories, but I can tell you that in Canada in 2021, women earned 89 cents on average for every dollar men earned. So building pay equity into the compensation practices of individual employers will help reduce the overall gender wage gap. Lastly, I just mentioned that the right to pay equity exists within separate workplaces or establishments. In the government of the Northwest Territories, the public service is its own establishment. Another establishment is the Power Corporation, and a third is Northwest Territories teachers. And so I'll take it to slide 5, and just continuing on the theme of pay equity. Pay equity measures the value of work based on the total of the skills, effort, responsibility associated with the work, and the conditions under which the work is performed. And by measuring it this way, pay equity allows us to compare different jobs to see if they are equal in value. It does something a little bit similar with compensation. Of course, compensation is a lot easier to compare, but it does look at total compensation that employees receive, including things like allowances and premium pay. And while there are certain types of compensation that are excluded, like seniority pay and merit pay, these exclusions are the exception and not the rule. And lastly, I'll just talk about the office that I occupy. So the Equal Pay Commissioner is a statutory officer appointed by the Legislative Assembly. And the office was created in 2004 when the Public Service Act was first amended to include pay equity. The Commissioner has a dual role. She receives pay equity complaints, conducts investigations, and assists parties to resolve complaints, and prepares investigation reports. The Commissioner also fosters greater understanding and awareness of the right to equal pay for work of equal value. I was initially appointed as the Acting Equal Pay Commissioner last October 2023, and I was subsequently confirmed as the Equal Pay Commissioner on March 26, 2024, for a 4-year term. So turning to page 7, I'll tell you a bit about the activities that I undertook in 23-24. First of all, my activities consisted of reaching out to and meeting with stakeholders, including officials from the GNWT, the Northwest Territories Power Corporation, and the UNW. I listened to the views, and I should have mentioned, I don't have them on my paper, but also the Teachers Union. I listened to the views of stakeholders and any concerns that they might have, and shared specific information about pay equity with them. I strongly encouraged voluntary compliance as an alternative to following a complaint-based process. In early 2024, I received a telephone inquiry from a former employee of the GNWT inquiring about a possible past pay equity entitlement. I did discuss the matter with the person and made some preliminary inquiries with the GNWT just to see how far back we would be able to get information if we needed to, if this person wanted to pursue the issue. However, when I returned to this person, they did not follow up. I also lastly want to mention that I obtained funding to develop a website for the Equal Pay Commissioner. The website went live in early April 2024. I promoted the website on social media, and website traffic, we saw a bit of a rush in April shortly after the site went up, and then quiet and steady traffic in May and June. It's been a little bit busier in July and August as this report was put together, as the annual report was put together. In terms of looking forward to 2024-25, I plan to continue to promote awareness and understanding, including what I think is very important is promoting voluntary compliance. And of course, if any complaints should be received, those would be investigated. Still on the topic of 24-25 or future years, I did want to invite the Legislative Assembly to think about what it might be able to do in relation to pay equity, and specifically to consider reviewing the pay equity provisions of the Public Service Act. The provisions are more than 20 years old now, and they may benefit from an update. In particular, I would say that consideration should be given to changing the system from a reactive complaint-based system into a proactive negotiated system. This approach can really only be done legislatively, and I cannot require any stakeholders to do this under the current act. I can only encourage voluntary compliance. The second theme where an update would be warranted is on the topic of maintenance of pay equity. This goes hand in hand with a proactive pay equity system, and it means that pay equity is reviewed and checked at regular intervals. This is important because even if pay equity is established at a point in time, inequities can gradually creep back in, and that's why regular check-ins are important. And those are my speaking points, and I would be happy to respond to any questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Caron. I have Mr. Hawkins first for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Madam Commissioner, for being here this evening and for your report. I know you're not new to the file in general, but you're certainly new to this current office, so I do appreciate that. I'm curious, I think you pointed out just last, that was one of my questions, which was reactive as opposed to proactive, and I was curious on how a complaint-driven process gets concerns and how do you action an investigation. So that's good that you brought forward, the question for the Assembly to wrestle with, which is it time to review the Act and take a look at the action? So perhaps that's something committee can discuss later. I think my first question will be focused around the example, and I say strictly as an example, called the Sunshine List. And some jurisdictions use the Sunshine List as transparency on what people are paid. Now that works in government, whereas in, they produce over a list of people over a certain pay, and there's full transparency on it, so you know who's getting what and on dollars. However, in private industry, you wouldn't necessarily have that. So I guess my question specifically to you is, what trends are you seeing to help identify processes to create transparency and equality amongst people? And so people understand either they're being treated fairly or unfairly, so in other words, so we can address the problems or they can be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you. Over to the Commissioner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. I would certainly note that there is a lot more interest and focus in recent years on pay transparency. I think it's very welcome that there should be an increase in pay transparency. I come from a background previously of having worked in the Government of Canada where all pay ranges are published and available publicly. And as the member mentioned, in government, this is not something new. It is interesting when I speak with employers, because I do work as well as a pay equity consultant. The pay transparency part of the discussion is often one of the most difficult things for employers to get over that hump. And I think that maybe having a legislative approach to pay transparency that ensures a level playing field for all employers so that nobody feels that they are disadvantaged would be an appropriate regulatory action. I'm certainly aware that the federal government quite recently has legislated pay transparency, and there is already a website available with some information on it. I'm not very deep into that website, but I am aware that there is some information there, and there is some compliance and enforcement happening in relation to it. It's very much a great partner for pay equity to have pay transparency.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Hawkins, do you have a follow-up?
I do, and just if the Commissioner can clarify we don't have to go back and forth, she can clarify in our next answer, is that targeted at the private industry as well? I just want to make sure that that's fully clear on the record. So my next question would be about where are you seeing challenges with respect to pay gaps in the Northwest Territories? If I got you correctly, when you pointed out you don't have a lot of data, so that I get is sometimes a challenge because we're a small jurisdiction, but you note 89 cents across Canada is considered the pay gap, if I've correctly qualified it to some extent. We're not a science project here, but in essence, if that's the right zone, that'll work for us for our conversation. But my issue specifically is how are we identifying concerns in the Northwest Territories? Can you give specific examples as to where this is a problem? And would you have recommendations on how we could help assist in closing those gaps once they've been identified? Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Over to the Commissioner for a response to that second question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. So first, just looping back to the previous question, yes, when I refer to the federal government's new legislation on pay transparency, yes, it applies to the private sector as well as the public sector. And it didn't really do a whole lot to change things in the public service of Canada. Maybe in some other parapublic employers, it might have been a bit of a new thing. But for private sector employers, it's a very big new thing, and it's very helpful. As for your question, where am I seeing challenges with respect to pay gaps in the Northwest Territories? I really wish I could give you an answer to that question, but I can't. In the absence of doing an analysis or receiving a complaint and actually digging in to see the compensation practices and the value of work of different families of work, I guess we could call them. Um, it's really just guesswork to say that we might have pay equity or we might not. It really truly is impossible to know unless you do a pay equity review or an exercise of some kind. Um, so we're kind of, sometimes I think we're kind of sitting on a quiet volcano that could erupt someday. And we don't know how big the eruption might be, and we don't know exactly when it's going to happen. And that's the complaint based system. With the proactive system, it's something that I favor because it allows employers to get on top of the situation early on and then through maintenance to check every 5 years so that you don't allow, uh, once again, for a lot of pressure to build up in the system, potentially creating the next eruption. Um, if I can, I hope it makes sense. And if you need clarification on why I can't answer specifics, I'd be happy to talk a little bit more about the nuts and bolts of pay equity, but maybe I won't go down that rabbit hole unless I'm clearly invited to do so. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the answer to the question. I'll move on to Ms. Reed for the next round.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Ms. Caron, for your presentation and report. So some silver lining in some of what you're speaking about this evening. It's my understanding that in the life of this government, Cabinet hopes to bring forward the Public Service Act for amendments. So this is a very timely presentation. I really appreciate your strong recommendations to change from a reactive system to a proactive system. I also understand that job descriptions are currently under a lens for a different project, but it would be wonderful if, as you say, they could be investigated a little more closely for equal pay purposes. In your report, you note that the systemic review is really needed to make traction on making sure we understand what pay equity looks like, at least in the public service. What would be the best practices for such a review? Thank you.
Thank you. Over to the Commissioner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I would say that a review, first of all, if legislation is amended, one piece would be to ensure that employers are given some time to put into place, to do the pay equity exercise or do that review and put that into place. So a certain amount of time is required, especially for larger employers. But, it's a two-sided coin, I guess. For smaller employers, they often don't have a ton of resources in their human resources department, if you will, or if they even have a department. So all employers need some time to be able to get this a proactive system implemented in their workplace. So that would be one component. I think another really crucial component would be to ensure that employees are given an opportunity to be involved, whether that be through their bargaining agent if they are unionized, and if they're not, then an opportunity to be involved through a pay equity committee, for example. It takes a bit more time for employers to go through the process when a pay equity committee is constituted, but a pay equity committee is a worthwhile vehicle to put in place because it helps to prevent disagreements, it helps to build consensus, and then it also will help to mitigate or minimize the possibility of complaints coming out at the back end of the process. You don't want a process where an employer has to invest a lot of time, first of all, doing the pay equity review exercise, then then employees aren't satisfied, then there are complaints, and then it goes back into litigation. That's really something that should be avoided. So I do think that having a pay equity committee process is a very valuable and useful way to go. but we take into account that it does take more time. Um, Apart from that, I would say certainly the maintenance, I've mentioned it already, but I think it's worth mentioning because there are some jurisdictions that have proactive pay equity, but there's not a lot of detail on what it means to maintain pay equity. And so it's very sporadic whether employers are doing it, and you don't have that kind of rigor and regular checking in. Whereas I think a properly designed legislation would provide for a time frame for maintenance to take place. I would say 5 years is reasonable. 5 or 6 years would be quite reasonable. I think that hits some of the key highlights.
Okay, thank you. Not seeing any follow-up from Ms. Reed. Mr. Rogers, do you have any questions for the Commissioner?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the presentation. No, I think most of the questions are similar to what I would have asked, have been asked. I mean, one of the things we always ask is what can we do, I guess, as a committee and as MLAs to assist or advocate, if you will, on behalf of the Commission for any potential, I guess, changes to the Act that would benefit kind of your office and your ability to do your job, I guess, would be the only kind of comment I would have. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Would the Commissioner like to respond to that one?
Well, I'm grateful for that comment. I wasn't sure if I was pushing the envelope too hard because being in a public official role is new to me. But I did feel that Ms. Waters had opened the door in relation to this topic in her annual report last year. So I decided to give it another little push this year, and I'm grateful that the committee is receptive to that comment about amending the legislation. Thank you.
Absolutely. We definitely appreciate such recommendations. So we can go for a second round of comments. If members have questions, just please raise your hand if you have any. Mr. Hawkins, go ahead.
I waved earlier.
Oh, okay.
Yes. So can you help can you help bring transparency to the transparency process? And what does that actually look like? When they create a process of transparency, can I assume, or is it fair to say that it is built around ranges of salary? So in other words, restaurant A, without naming any, early new employees make salary ranges between X and X, or X and Y, sorry, and managers make salaries between A and B. Is it that type of thing, or is it generally speaking more specific? I'm just curious on what one would, when we talk about, could this roll out eventually one day, someday, to the private industry or private sector, what it may appear like. I'm just curious on what you're seeing and the intent of the federal direction provided on this. Thank you.
Thank you. Over to the Commissioner for comment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. First, I will acknowledge that I am not an expert in pay transparency or pay transparency legislation. I do have a level of awareness, but I don't have the level of expertise in the details of that legislation to be able to really speak with authority about it. I would only say I think it is ranges. I can speak, though, about pay equity when we do pay equity reviews under the federal legislation. There is a sharing of data and information around ranges of compensation that are applicable to all of the jobs in an organization. So that kind of information is shared with employees who are on the pay equity committee or bargaining agents who are usually more knowledgeable but may not already know about all of the management ranges and so on and so forth. Once they're in the pay equity committee, they do have that information. That kind of detailed information I do not believe has to be published in federal pay equity studies that are done. It may be, but I do not believe that it is a requirement that it be published in those pay equity studies. With that being said, it may very well already be a requirement under pay transparency legislation. I'm just not 100% sure.
Thank you. Mr. Hawkins, you have a follow-up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Okay, now I can definitely appreciate that perspective. The next question I have really is about how are we still here? And it's really got me kind of discombobulated around the context of how would we still have this challenge in this day and age. So I'm not asking you to argue for this problem. I'm just trying to understand how and why you're still seeing this problem when you do an investigation. You know, are people doing this on purpose? Are they doing it just because they've always done it, or is it just because they're and what happens when this is done in the context of investigation? In other words, you know, once it's highlighted and talked about and I'll say dealt with, you know, are people usually like, oh my goodness, I'm going to fix it right away? Like, I'm just trying to get a sense of, perhaps it's a bit naive on my part, but I mean, I have such a difficult time imagining this is being done purposely in these days. And so I'm not saying that there aren't people making bad choices. It's just, can you describe some of the challenges and how it's confronted and what type of sunshine, you know, sort of reveals when you're investigating it? Thank you.
Thank you. Over to the Commissioner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. So that's a really good question, and it's one I ask myself. I think it's mostly not happening on purpose. And I will say, of course, I haven't received any complaints to investigate, and I can speak from my experience in the federal government and also now as a consultant in the private sector. By and large, it's not being done on purpose. It is because of the way employers organize work, the way work is evaluated, and the way work is compensated. So the way we organize work is, I think there is some rooting, and you'll be aware of employment equity, which looks at how you'll find different areas of work or different pockets of work which are strongly female, and then other pockets of work which are strongly male. And the creation of those pockets of work is not just something that employers do. It's something that I think as a society we do in a way that we're not even conscious of. People are gravitating. Women will gravitate to jobs more often where they see others like themselves, more women, and men will often do the same thing because of stereotypes that they believe are imposed on them, that they believe this is the kind of job they should be interested in or looking for. The way work is evaluated is also potentially an area for creating some of the inequities. In particular, sometimes women's work is not always visible. Some of the things that women have to do in their jobs, have to quote unquote put up with in their jobs, because of the nature of their duties, is not always valued by employers and by HR professionals. Although I think that is getting better, there's still more work to be done in that area. And lastly, on compensation, of course, employers, when they hire employees, they look to the labor market to determine how they should pay. And the labor market does embed some systemic discrimination in how women are paid. It comes from many, many years and decades and even centuries, and a very gradual process of women trying to catch up with their pay, but it's still there. There are some shocking cases where this kind of discrimination happens on purpose. I wish I remember the names, but I do recall there was an incident involving a reporter, a very high-level reporter with the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, a few years ago, and it made the news. And she left the BBC when she found out she was being paid something like 60% what her equal value male colleague was being paid. Um, and oh, sorry, that's for my kids. um, and there was a bit of a flurry at that time, and there were also issues of young people working in a fast food restaurant, and a young woman, maybe it was Alberta, it was somewhere in Canada. She asked her male friend what he was being paid, and she was promptly fired for discussing pay with her colleague at work. And of course, she found out that she was being paid less than her male friend, who, they just had summer jobs. So those are those are the shocking, purposeful cases that you just have to shake your head when you hear about them, and it's very disappointing that that happens. But I guess for me, those serve as a bit of a reminder that, we've still got a long way to go if that's still happening, even though I'm sure it's in the minority. But the systemic issues are the ones that I think pay equity is more interested in trying to tackle and grapple with.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Hawkins, do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, just briefly, thank you. I think really, thank you for answering that. It got me thinking when you described it, and I wonder if sometimes we get there, in project management terms, we often call these, we use a phrase quite generously, it's called scope creep, where one day you're doing one thing and all of a sudden you're doing a little more and a little more and a little more. And I'm kind of wondering if this is a systemic problem of small sectors where, you hire everybody at $10 an hour, for example, but then one person is demonstrating they're following through, and all of a sudden they're doing 2 or 3 times the amount of work, or taking the 2 or 3 times of responsibility, and it becomes the norm, and the norm becomes not just a trend, but it becomes galvanized in the process of doing things. And I'm thinking, as listening to your answers, as in this is typically a small sector challenge, and I'm saying not government when I'm referring to small sector, whereas they wouldn't do regular job evaluations or assessments and whatnot. Maybe it started off with good intentions and all of a sudden it blew up, or maybe it started off with malfeasance from the beginning, which is I can get away with something and no one will know. So anyway, your comments drew out sort of more questions in the sense of how we got there. I certainly would like to see that end, obviously. I just want to make sure that that's clear. And I definitely believe in the principles of fairness. So yeah, thank you for that. I mean, that's just largely a comment, but you got me thinking about how sometimes, not justifying, but recognizing sometimes how people get there. Thank you.
Thanks. Does the Commissioner have a response to that comment?
No, Mr. Chairperson, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Reid, I have you next for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is a bit of a hypothetical question, and I realize it's outside of the current scope of your office at the moment, but as we're talking about possibilities this evening, I was wondering if we could and should be expanding the concept of equal pay for equal work so that it applies to perhaps race and not just gender. For example, in government we have Indigenous language interpreters or translators, French language translators. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Over to the Commissioner for a response.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. What a wonderful question. I think that this is something that is definitely worth consideration. I will point to the United States, where there are some jurisdictions, because I've read some pay equity report from the United States and some literature from the United States, where it's not only gender, it also looks at race. So I think it's a really interesting question. I think I couch it in those terms because I would love to understand and see data that helps see where racialized people may be employed, and if they're in similar kind of employment equity sort of situation as women often are in, meaning they're going to certain pockets of jobs. And if that's the case, that's an even, like, that would be more of a warning flag. If we had a perfect scenario where women and men and all of the races were perfectly interspersed in all of the different jobs that we have, we wouldn't have any pay equity issues and we wouldn't have any employment equity issues. But that's not how life really is. I can't speak with any authority about where racialized people, like which jobs they may find themselves in. But if that is the case, then I really do think it's worth considering. Yes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Reid, do you have a follow-up on that?
Sort of. I'm intrigued. I'm very heartened by your answer. I don't know if there's anything committee can do to support. If there's a project that we could do, or if there's a project that your office would like to pursue on this, yeah, please let us know. But I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Does the Commissioner have any further comment on the topic?
No, thank you, Mr. Chairperson.
Mr. Rogers, do you have a question for round two? No, I don't see one there. Mr. Hawkins, have you got further questions?
Yeah, thank you. Maybe just one last one is, outside of your report recommendations, would you have anything that we should consider or hear that other jurisdictions are looking at or considering at this particular time? Not all jurisdictions are equal in isn't this kind of funny we're talking equal pay? Not all, they're not all equal, but that said, they're tackling problems different ways, and I'm curious if you have heard or seen how they're challenging some of these issues or addressing these issues, and something we should put on our radar for future consideration. Thank you.
Thank you. Over to the Commissioner for a response.
Thank you, Mr. Chairperson. I would say that internationally, Canada is one of the leaders in terms of pay equity legislation, and we have been for a very long time. I still think there's a lot of work to be done, but the Northwest Territories stands in that group as one of the leaders in pay equity legislation. Maybe that's a testament to the fact that globally this is not enough on the front burner. I would say that I would be very cautious about pursuing too much of a design like Ontario's. Ontario actually has been at the forefront of equal pay for many milestones. However, they do have a design element of requiring comparisons to the lowest compensated equal male comparator, and I would certainly stay very far away from that concept. I am aware that some employers in Ontario don't follow that requirement, and they or that I don't know if it's a requirement. It's kind of a giveaway in a way. And rather than doing that, they follow the average of the equal comparators to determine what pay gaps there may be. I think the federal government's legislation and Quebec's legislation do provide very good models to think about what proactive pay equity may look like. They're not perfect either, but they have those components that I mentioned earlier, which is giving time to employers for the initial round, having pay equities involving employees, involving bargaining agents where they are in a workplace. They apply to the public sector and the private sector, and they have maintenance requirements that are quite specific. So those are the areas in which I think it's really important for any pay equity legislation to cover those things off.
Thank you. I don't see further questions from Mr. Hawkins. Just going to give committee one more chance to ask questions if need be. Seeing none. Ms. Caron, do you want to make any closing comments to committee? It seems like we've exhausted our questions for this evening, so if you had any closing comments, by all means, now's the time.
No, thank you, Mr. Chairperson. I just thought I would sit and answer the questions, and I do appreciate, though, the engagement of the committee members. It's always a pleasure to talk about pay equity. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And yeah, committee extends our thanks to you for making time to discuss this with us tonight and for sharing your annual report with us. So that concludes today's public briefing. So thank you very much to both the Languages Commissioner, Ms. Brenda M. Gauthier, and the Equal Pay Commissioner, Ms. Renée Caron, for their reports. And this concludes the public portion of the briefing. I'll have committee members stick around for debrief. So thank you very much, and thanks to the folks who were tuning in.
Thank you. Goodbye.